Okay, and I'm live. Today is the 26th of February. Actually, the most beautiful day of the year so far here in London. And in stark contrast to the horrific images that are now coming out of Ukraine following Russia's invasion um, of that country. Now, it's interesting to see what is going on in the media, the kind of coverage that we're getting. And it seems to me that a lot of the mainstream media has gone very long on sending horrific images of airstrikes, artillery strikes, small arms fire. And when you look at these pictures, you ask yourselves whether, in 2022, with the kind of weapons that are available to humanity, whether going to war actually makes sense, because the damage we wreak is so horrific, but it's going on. And what's the impact? The impact is that it makes people feel numb with worry, with sorrow, with horror, and people are basically completely stuck watching the stuff like a deer in the headlights. Now, the response of many of the commentators I've seen is to pander to people. Because actually, it seems to me people don't so much want to understand what's going on as they want to feel good about themselves. That is particularly people in the West. How so? Well, it seems to me that the truth is that we have all, as citizens in completely independent countries, been co creators for the longest time of the drama that's unfolding out near Kiev right now. How have we become co creators? It's because we have been bribed into silently watching the attitudes and policies of our various countries towards that region. And we have gone along with it. And now we are seeing the consequences of our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors for the past 15, 20 years. And we're saying, oh, how horrific. And of course, the mainstream media is doing its job of ladling out oodles of uh, horror inducing pictures. Now, these horror inducing pictures are very useful for two things. One, they're useful for creating trauma in people who watch them. And secondly, they're useful in programming the people who watch them into a certain mindset. So if we go along with the series of events as they're going along, we are helping the authorities, whoever's behind all of this, to co create the horrors we're seeing in the Ukraine right now. Now, one of the people who has been spectacularly sideswiped, undermined, and basically kind of deplatformed over the past few years is David Icke. But there is one phrase David Icke comes with that perfectly explains our situation. He says that if you want to understand the journey, you must recognize what the destination is. Now, look at the destination. Russia is a member of the Security Council. If the highest authority, the UN, United Nations, with its Security Council, were to sit down and decide on a series of actions against Russia in its actions in Ukraine, Russia would just veto it. It couldn't happen. It could be scotched right from the get go. And so it means that the UN, as we have it in the present form, isn't good enough to ensure peace on our blue pebble. What's the alternative? The alternative, of course, is to create another instrument or a variant of the United Nations, which enables the world to act as one with overwhelming authority to ensure that those of us who have been um, horrified by the images that we see in Ukraine can feel as if we can control that situation. Now, what kind of instrument would that be? Of course, a one world state with a one world army, with a total world authority. Now, that would be a solution to the problems that we have now. And actually, it's only been a couple of days since Russia yomped into Ukraine, and people are thinking, "What can we do? What can we do? What can we do?" It's only a matter of time before somebody comes up and says, "Look, we need to take this to the next level and create an instrument which has even more force, more power, more authority than the United Nations, and create this one world state." If that was going to be our objective, then of course everything that's happening right now totally and utterly makes sense. As a man of my age, it is breathtakingly stupid for the actors and the agents in this matter to imagine that they can creep up, tiptoe up to the border of Russia and expect the Russians to sit back and think, ooh, nothing to see here, no existential threat. Let's let Ukraine slide slowly into the Western European orbit, slide slowly into NATO, so that in a fair few years' time, we will have NATO rockets on our doorsteps. Now, the last time that sort of thing happened, the shoe was on the other foot. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I remember I was a very little boy, but I knew that the whole world was living in terror of something. My father was was a senior diplomat, and him and all his mates were very, very worried that something awful could happen to the world. Of course, what did Kennedy do? He told Khrushchev that if your ships keep coming over to Cuba, which is on our doorstep, to assemble these rockets right off the Florida Keys, we will not only destroy your ships en route, we will also blow Castro out of the water. The solution? Everything rolled backwards. But of course, it was a raft of solutions because it also meant that the Americans had to withdraw their rockets from the Crimea, which was very close to the Russian shores. So the frank foolishness of what's going on now is beyond belief. I mean, it is so stupid that you would have to imagine that intelligent international diplomats and foreign policy experts would not create this sort of debacle by accident. It is by design. So what I've said is that once you understand the destination could be the creation of a one world state, then everything we're seeing now fits. One segue I think I ought to mention here is that whenever you see anything on social media that just gets you in your quote unquote feels instantly without a proper narrative, without a proper rationale behind it, then it's being manufactured to get you all worked up so that you can shout for a response or an action. There are lots and lots of events like that happening in social media. I don't need to tell you that. So, I mentioned mind control. If, and the Americans showed this through several decades of something called their MK Ultra program. If you find a way of sufficiently destabilizing the human mind, i.e., creating sufficient trauma in it, you can virtually wipe that mind and install a new reality in it and get that person to follow upon that reality. The trauma we have been through right now, through COVID, through the lockdowns, through the incursions on our bodily autonomy with the vaccines, uh, through the resulting political upheavals that took place, have traumatized human beings. Who would have thought? I certainly wouldn't, not in my lifetime. Who would have thought that a liberal democracy like Canada, and remember, back in the day, everybody thought Canada was the country America was supposed to be because the Canadians were warm, affable, pleasant, laid back, emollient, never extreme in anything. Who would have thought that Canada would come up with a leader like Trudeau, who in true, and I say this not lightly, extreme right-wing fashion, was completely beasting his people and driving a coach and 6 horses through their human rights. Who would have thought that possible? Take Australia. Mother country, presumably what you would call the United Kingdom, mother of parliaments, mother of democracies in the modern Western world. Look at the draconian measures they've taken, along with New Zealand, which is really kind of a cousin state to its Antipodean neighbor, which is Australia. Look at America. Look at the extreme measures that have been taken involving kind of riding through bodily autonomy, mandating experimental biological agents, to which there were consequences, and which, if you follow the rules of natural justice, as long as there is a consequence for taking a risk, that risk cannot be mandated by any authority, quite about breaking the Nuremberg rules. So, for all of these reasons, human beings have been hugely destabilized. And with that state of shock that the majority of people are in, all you need to do is to heap on more trauma, and people become much more easy to coerce and drive towards a particular goal. Now, one other thing I ought to mention is that I would say, starting since the Conference of Berlin and the real ingraining of the philosophy of race, a mentality is being created in Western Europe in which there is a hierarchy of values. What is happening now in the Ukraine is no different to what has happened, in fact, a smidgen of what has happened in the Congo, Somalia, and so many other African countries, but African lives never really mattered. In the West, the injustices meted out on visible minority ethnics in America, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in all of these other countries have been many and legion, despite a host of legal instruments supposed to protect the rights of people. Everybody has lived in denial of the double standards applied. And so when it comes time to stand up for truth and justice, most people's first inclination is to prove to themselves that they are good people, that I am not a bad person. And because they have been bribed into taking part in this this edifice, this narrative of racial, social, and class injustice, They have taken part in creating the circumstances that we now face. And, it's much more difficult to stand up to something if somewhere deep in yourself, you yourself feel guilty or ashamed, however much you want to deny it. And so, if we are to be honest with ourselves, we know that we have aided those who have abused most of our rights in doing the things that they did. We supported the Canadian government in its treating of the the First Nation Canadians. We supported the Australian government in its treatment of the First Nation Australians. Same thing has happened in Southern America. Same thing has happened across the whole of Africa through the process of colonization. And because we feel guilty and ashamed, the most important thing, it seems to me, society wants to do is to pretend the past hasn't happened. And that's what makes society weak. The moment we are able to own up to what we have been a part of in the past, our strength flows back in absolute gallons. We become lions. We become absolutely unconquerable. But because those who conned us into supporting their bogus enterprises against other people know of our sense of shame and guilt, they know we are completely bribable. So, my friends, the solution to situations like the Ukraine don't lie in the creation of a totalitarian world state. The solution to problems like the Ukraine lie in us recapturing our moral integrity, a true sense of justice. A sense of justice not based on supremacism of any kind, because it is that very supremacism that has helped us support those who are creating these conflicts to create the injustices which are leading to these conflicts. If we didn't think, for example, that we in the West were superior to those in the East, if we didn't think, for example, that it was okay for us to teach them how to be because we are more civilized people, we wouldn't do half the things that we have done or watched being done in our name in the East. And that is what weakens us today. So, the solution is very simple. One, drop the double standards. It's called moral relativism or hypocrisy. First, drop the double standards. When you drop the double standards, what do you wind up with? A sense of humanism. When you have a sense of humanism, humanism doesn't know whether the guy comes from Knightsbridge, which is the posh end of London, or a less salubrious part of this great city. Both have equal value. At the moment, they don't. We know they don't. We support the fact that they don't. We pay lip service to the fact that they should, but we know that they don't. And so we are tarred by that brush. Secondly, living in denial of these realities is what enables us to be drawn into these ridiculous shenanigans. Don't tell me people in Germany did not know what was going to happen to the Jews. Not after Kristallnacht. It was demonstrated clearly to the society that something awful was coming up over the horizon. The Germans staged them. Don't tell me the people of Europe didn't know what was happening under colonialism. It was writ large everywhere. The people staged them. Why? Because they were bribed with the privileges that being on the home team involved. Once we stop living in denial of these things, And by the way, for God's sake, don't be so arrogant as to think that you can't make a mistake. We all make mistakes. Mistakes are in the very DNA of life. It is because of the mistakes that we learn what is right. You can't have light without darkness. You can't have darkness without light. So grow a pair, take responsibility, stop living in denial. Thirdly, the idea of divide and rule, where we create a philosophy of race in which there is a hierarchy of race. Sometimes it's a hierarchy of gender. Sometimes it's a hierarchy of class. Sometimes it's a hierarchy of education. As long as we have these different standards of worth, merit, and value, of course, we will be turned one against the other. And once we've been turned one against the other, the shame and guilt that follows means that if you're a normal human being, you're going to have to live in denial of that just to live with yourself. Let's not fall for the divide and rule. And finally, the only way to protect ourselves against these events that are running crazily over in the Ukraine is for us to raise our spiritual resonance. Do you know, I can't tell you know, we all know the difference between right and wrong. We all know that being untruthful isn't helpful. But the moral backbone to be able to live what we know to be right, correct, true, and proper derives from our spiritual strength until we collectively, as genus Homo sapiens, develop the capacity, the spiritual capacity to live in our truth. If it's not Ukraine, tomorrow it'll be something else. And the day after it'd be some. I'm just waiting for them to say that, we've just been invaded by aliens. And so as a result of that, we need to create a totalitarian world state so that none of us have any rights because the aliens are coming, the aliens are coming. It's insane. So that is how you and I play a part in the drama that's unfolding in Ukraine. And the solution to it is for us to claim back our moral integrity and not allow ourselves to be divided and ruled and join this knuckle dragging, dinosaur-like way of life of war and a bit of peace and then more conflict and a bit of peace and then more conflict, because also the weapons become more and more and more lethal. You are not my enemy and I am not yours. The Russians are not the enemies of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are not enemies of the Russians. The Americans aren't enemies of the Russians. The Russians aren't enemies of the Americans. But they will be as long as the people allow themselves to be divided so they can be ruled. Thanks very much for watching. And final tip, be very careful about the rubbish that they're going to be sending you to watch, because the whole idea is for you to go begging, cap in hand and on bended knee, please create a totalitarian world state in which all my rights are given, surrendered to the state so that we can stop these wars. Don't fall for it. Thanks for listening.